Chapter 13, Pathology, Psychosis. As we have repeatedly said, the model we are using involves imagining the conscious and subconscious having a semi-permeable membrane separating them. The access between the conscious and subconscious occurs when we are sleeping, and the information flows freely forwards and backwards in our memory banks. What we are virtually doing is making our experiences. In the conscious level, we have the front room or control panel, which is the part we are aware of, and behind it is the automatic everything, which is scanning and drawing on our previous experiences. Obviously, this has a conduit going into our subconscious level, but we are never aware of this unless we do some kind of psychotherapeutic intervention, such as psychoanalysis. I would state that hypnosis, in my opinion, deals mainly with the partition between awareness and non-awareness and is part of the conscious. It is my opinion that, if hypnosis was so deep as it goes into the subconscious level, the outcome would be very dangerous. I think when you read what happens in a psychosis you will fully understand why. So, you see that we have a permeable wall between the conscious and subconscious, which is breached only at night when we are sleeping. Between the aware and unaware conscious, we have a virtual curtain which is more easily penetrated. Nevertheless, a lot of what is going on behind the curtain, we are not aware of. As we have pointed out, from a developmental and evolutionary point of view, we have gained enormously from this setup. Nevertheless, things can go wrong, and they do. You can best picture psychosis in two ways. The first way is the sensation one has when awakening suddenly or even unexpectedly. The feeling of confusion, lack of orientation, everything seems muddled, the feeling's bizarre and unrelated to anything. The other way of thinking of a psychosis is wandering in and out of fog. 1 minute everything seems clear, the next minute nothing is clear, everything is completely different, and all we are aware of is being alone and unsure. Have you noticed that I am explaining the psychosis in cognitive terms? I want to stop at this point to explain both the cognitive and the emotional aspects of what goes wrong when a patient is psychotic. Firstly, the known connection between thoughts and feelings, as we know it, breaks down. The connection no longer acts as we knew it before. What does this mean? The psychotic, particularly the schizophrenic, starts to feel things which he experienced when they had another unrelated experience. It's as if the psychotic is experiencing dreams whilst awake. The bizarre or strange feelings we cannot identify, along with the cognitive aspects which are as disordered as in a dream. This is what horror movies are made of, and we are reminded of our dreams. As long as this happens when sleeping, that's very good. Imagine what it's like when you're not sleeping. Let's take the emotional aspect a little bit further. If you remember, we spoke about the mood. I find it most instructive to ask the psychotic what do they feel. I give them a choice. Do you feel deep anxiety, sadness, or emptiness and boredom? The acute psychotic tends to feel a deep anxiety. I then ask if the anxiety is as if you did something wrong and are about to be found out, even you do not know what it is you did wrong? Generally, they answer no. As you will see in the next chapter, this is an answer I expect from a neurotic. They often do answer in the affirmative to the follow-up, do you feel that you feel as if you are in front of cataclysmic catastrophe? If this is the first psychosis over the age of 30, you have to rule out incipient brain pathology. If they are sad, the neurotic gives a reasonable explanation, but the psychotic's explanation is weird. An answer of emptiness and boredom in a known psychotic is pointing to the paucity of all the functioning in the way the psychotic now thinks and feels. One pathognomonic question and answer is about daydreams. In my clinical experience, post-psychotics do not daydream, nor do they present with PTSD. It does seem that before the psychosis began, their fantasy life was extremely inhibited, but no one noticed. Tzvi's story. Tzvi was a delightful guy. He had beautiful slanted blue eyes, eyes of a dreamer who dreamed dreams that only he could see. He told me how, as a soldier, he would run off into the Zen desert. There, Tzvi would climb up a mystical ladder and visit places that only he could see or imagine. From there, he could picture the world, and see things and understand things which were surely going to prepare him for something wonderful. This was to be the first time I was to hear something which was pathognomonic of an impending psychosis, the sense of a revelation. Time after time, day after day, he would climb his ladder, and then he would climb down again and go back to his army base. You may think it strange that no one in the army noticed he was missing. If you do, you don't know the army. Eventually, they did notice, and in his words, every day, I would go up the ladder and come down from the ladder. Then one day, someone came and found me up the ladder and took it away. I couldn't get down again. Then I found myself in hospital. They brought me down and then burnt the ladder. Now I have no way of going back. It wasn't so much as Tzv and his description of a psychosis with his feeling of having lost something, when in actual fact, those around him felt they had helped him. I often wonder about Tzv and his ladder. Till this day I wonder if we had the right to take it away from him. We said that thoughts and feelings act on the thermostat which we call mood. When we are sad, we think pessimistically. When we think pessimistic thoughts, we become sad. When we are happy, we think optimistically, and when we think positively, our mood lightens. I digress for a moment, but one of the stranger aspects of mental illness is that we see a positive feedback. In other words, the thought does not enter into vicious circles which we cannot escape and get deeper and deeper. Imagine that you are circling down into a vortex of your sadness. Your mood is getting ever and ever deeper, and like a cyclone, you are sucked into it. Then you realize that as you become psychotic, your thoughts would be dragged along. They become distorted to match the mood. Like a black hole mangles the laws of physics, the black hole of psychotic mood disorders mangles reality testing. Let's take it a step further. We love explaining, and we need to explain. As you will see later in my therapy, particularly CBT, I will explain how important this is. Suffice it to say that mankind spends a lot of time explaining things. Explanations calm us down, and when they are wrong, we go back and look for another explanation. When we get into a vicious circle here, we call it OCD. We will discuss this more fully in the next chapter. I will touch on the relevance of positive feedback in a few sentences. It is important when reading this chapter to realize as the mood takes over, the thermostat sticks. Feelings and thoughts ricochet off each other. It is like an enormous ever-increasing feedback we hear in pop concerts. Man, the explainer, will make every effort to explain, and the depressive searches his memory in the automatic everything to explain. The coloring thinking dyad in the automatic everything runs amok, as things get increasingly worse and are no longer reacting to what is going on around. The process takes over and smashes into awareness. What I mean by this? If we are depressed, we start having explanations which explain why we are depressed. As we said before, we are no longer in touch with our previous experiences. We are grasping for an explanation, and as in all psychosis, the breakdown between reality and our previous experiences breaks down. We no longer see either our reality or our previous experiences. At this stage, the patient is psychotic, be it manic or depressive. If the barrier between the conscious and subconscious disintegrates, then both thoughts and feelings become bizarre. This is called a schizoaffective disorder. Now, we will take yet another long detour as we discuss positive feedback. I have mentioned that most of biology and most of mankind is functioning with things which operate under a negative feedback. That's a posh way of saying that when you eat more you become less hungry. Eating stops you from being hungry, and hungry makes you eat. A positive feedback is if eating makes you more hungry. We would never stop eating and would explode. Unfortunately, when we are in a psychotic depression, we are no longer in the negative feedback system. As we go deeper and deeper into the vortex, our thoughts adapt themselves to the feelings, and we start thinking things about ourselves which aren't true. But they are adaptive, or should I say maladaptive to the mood and feelings we have. A depressed psychotic will tell you that he is being punished, and he deserves to be punished because he's done something awful. We've all done something awful. It's very easy to say I have a guilty conscience and try and give absolution. With a psychotic, depressive absolution can't work. The sufferer is angry as the all-consuming bad mood demands and has taken control over the cognitive process. You can easily imagine how, in such a situation, the sufferer will decide that the best solution is death, and he deserves to die. Very unfortunately indeed, shortly after giving birth, mothers have a depression due to the hormonal turmoil. In the depths of the depression, their thought processes serve the mood's tyranny and decide that the world is such a bad place, it is better for the newborn child not to face it. This scenario is one of the most harrowing ones we psychiatrists have to face. I'm sure you all know that psychotic depression is often referred to as bipolar. Just as easily as the mood becomes autonomous in depression, it can do so in elation. As miserable as the depressive is, the manic patient has a mood which is amazingly good. They become excited, their thoughts race and their thoughts are elated as to explain why they are so happy. Again, the thoughts have lost all connection with previous experiences and are just serving the monstrous mood which has taken over everything. Consequently, the manic will make some very bizarre claims to explain why he is so invigorated. We have heard many manics coming out and claiming they have had revelations that they are the Messiah or they have incredible plans how to become rich overnight. The overall damage that a manic patient can do to his family is often as bad as, and sometimes can be worse than, the severe depression. In the severe depression, we are faced with the possibility of suicide. This, of course, is a terrible thing to happen to any family. A manic can, and often does, completely destroy the family and even business concerns by wild bursts of completely psychotic spending sprees. Manic depressives can exhibit both mania and depression at the same time. They are very difficult to treat. David S.'s story Part 1. David S. is difficult to call a patient. I believe that he became a friend and someone who I trusted deeply and would often ask questions. As you can gather, there will be more parts to David's story, as we go along. David had the most glorious of manic episodes. His mood would lighten, and like a leaf in the autumn breeze, he would start to flutter around. His face would become cherubic, he seemed to need less sleep and he became extremely enthusiastic. David was born into a very rich family and experienced his first manic episode when he was trying to rescue his father's crashing empire. He failed miserably and ended up in a closed ward. But David, when healthy, was a brilliant engineer. He loathed being depressed because it took away his good thoughts and his ability to improvise. He always sought to be slightly manic. It was as if, as another patient once explained, he was having a permanent orgasm. There is nothing better I could wish for than having a manic episode, providing you don't end up tied to a bed in a closed ward. Unfortunately, as David became manic and entered into his vortex, he felt he didn't need medication. In fact, the prodromal sign of David's impending mania was the optimistic feeling that he was well and didn't need anything. At work, David was well liked and his story was well known, as was the devotion of his loving wife. They started phoning up and telling her that David was coming out with some very bizarre ideas. At this point, David was certain that he could solve most and every problem. He would become irrational and irritable, and eventually, would be laid off work. There were times when David decided he was going to back his own ideas with his own money. Thankfully, we had made his wife his legal guardian, and she was in full control of the money. More of David's story will come as we progress. We did discuss, when talking about evolution of feelings, that there are good and bad feelings which give rise to sadness and happiness, which in turn affect mood. As we have seen above, sadness and happiness can morph into mania and depression when we are discussing psychosis. There is another feeling or emotion we have to discuss, and that is anxiety. There is such a thing as a psychotic anxiety, and it is completely different from what I refer to as neurotic anxiety. Here, we have to go back and look at the model we used when we were talking about the development of separation and individuation. When we discuss separation individuation, it is the first time the child realizes he is separate and yet has no control over a threatening world. The child is unable to think this through. He is emotionally aware that there is something out there. The child is under threat. He is facing an existential crisis. The child is alone and threatened. He does not know what the threat is, but the child is sure it is there and it can destroy. Remember, there are no cognitive attributes accompanying this feeling. The child hasn't developed it yet. This is the feeling the psychotic often has, especially the schizophrenic. I often ask the patient who is feeling anxious to define his anxiety. I ask him, do you feel that what you've done, you are about to be punished for? Remember, the true anxiety is the anxiety the toddler feels as he leaves the mother and explores his surroundings, an anxiety which has cognitive aspects and attributes. The psychotic looks bemused and I ask if the feeling is as if the world is about to end and you don't know why. The patient whose answer is yes, is in my opinion, almost certainly psychotic. Very often, it is the harbinger of a full-blown psychotic breakdown, and we will discuss this later in therapy and treatment. There is one other emotional aspect we should discuss in psychosis. Often, the patient feels as if there is no emotion whatsoever. They feel empty, an emptiness which is different in quality from those of personality disorders. The psychotic void of feeling is as if there can be no feeling. It was once there, but it has been eradicated. The concept of feeling has disappeared. I will mention that the emptiness the psychotic feels has similarities to the emptiness some personality disorder sufferers experience. I will describe the personality disorder later. But the emptiness is very different. The psychotic has stopped feeling, but he knows the feelings should be there and he needs them. I will explain it fully in the personality disorder section, that this personality disorder sufferer always felt emptiness. This has tremendous consequence, as you will see later. In the world of the psychotic, breakdown occurs at two places. The first is between the conscious and subconscious. The contact between our previous experiences changes. I picture it similarly to the wiring where the connections have gone awry. We mentioned the phenomena above when we were talking about thoughts and feelings being attached in different ways to what they were before. It is as if our consciousness is unable to connect with our experiences in the previous way and we are somehow living the nightmare. Let us attempt to further define what happens in the psychotic cognitive processes. When not psychotic, the difference between the subconscious and the conscious is that the conscious cognition behaves in rational ways. It is able to process orderly in time and place. It is capable of accurately or fairly accurately, as we will see later in neurosis, to say when things are happening. It tries to obey the physical laws that time flows in one direction. Similarly, in the conscious level, we are generally able to say where things belong and what are their boundaries. We are able to put in store, at a conscious level, all that is going on around us in different containers. Imagine ourselves like a huge cargo vessel below. There is a different way of storing stuff in the sea. But in the vessel, we have every container stored. We know where it is and what's in it. The container vessel is our conscious. There are two ruptures that can occur, a rupture between aware and non-aware and a rupture between conscious and subconscious. Let us imagine a rupture between the aware and non-aware part of our conscious. The first thing that happens in a psychosis is that the basic laws of physics are broken. Time can flow in any direction and indeed, things become non-consequential and non-subsequent. There is no cause and effect, and there is no flowing time. The second thing that happens is that the cognitive side of our non-aware conscience loses contact with our stored experiences in a similar manner to our emotions and feelings. They become jumbled and become as if new. This as if new experience occurred from nowhere. A fiction becomes an established fact for the psychotic. This phenomenon can happen in certain neurotic and even personality disturbances. We will discuss this later. But this psychosis is different in quality with the rupture between the conscious and subconscious. There is also a breakdown in the cognitive process. Remember, I was speaking about budding and the selection of the fittest. This process tool breaks down. It seems to me that it is more marked in the evolution of thoughts. In this kind of psychotic breakdown, we can follow the bizarre logic. Let us look at the rupture between conscious and subconscious. In addition to the above, we see something new. To simplify the difference, the psychotic connections and connectivity with experiences are bizarre. They are dreamlike, or should I say nightmare-like? In feelings, we notice that what is stored seems to be bizarre, and when the psychotic refers to the experiences experienced, the emotional response seems bizarre. Let me give you an example. In his delusion, the psychotic can declare something weird and frightening is happening. On his face can be the most inappropriate grin. This technical term we call affect. I wouldn't go into it too deeply at this point, because affect is one of the most overrated aspects of psychiatry. Judging the quality of a person's emotional reaction by our own emotional reaction is so imprecise that it is meaningless. Nevertheless, if you're going to become a professional, don't dare say that to one of your examiners. Similarly, we lose the ability to refer back to our experiences because of the same faulty wiring we discussed above. Automatic behavior becomes short-circuited, and behavior often becomes inappropriate and sometimes bizarre. Very often, the psychotic not only chooses the wrong bud, but it is as if all the usual cues have gone astray. Again, the referral back to our previous experiences is faulty. All the same two things occur. They do crazy things and they have no ability to appreciate what they are doing. They cannot refer back to their experiences in a meaningful way. As you see, what could have been a useful negative feedback loop which reinforces finding the right bud and discarding the wrong one, where the inappropriate one has also betrayed us. We, as observers, in this kind of psychosis, as opposed to the break between aware and non-aware, feel completely alienated from the patient. You will be amazed how often a non-bizarre psychotic tells a story that has a ring of truth. The paranoid psychotic is convinced and the conviction tugs at the therapist's reality testing, too. These two parameters are known as judgment and reality testing. What they are doing is evaluating if the pilot in the spaceship understands what is happening and can evaluate not only what it means, but also what is to be done about it. Yet, the pilot has no idea that his database of experiences and his computer of the automatic everything are both broken. By definition, the pilot has no ability to see this. The pilot's reality and the pilot's judgment are flawed. Conventional psychiatry defines psychosis as defects in these two parameters. I feel the defect is wider. There are two further aspects of the psychosis which we must mention now. I have made a great play about daydreaming and dreaming. It would seem that the psychotic not only has lost the ability to separate the past from the present and to integrate his experiences into his present experience, but there is something more. In my experience, nearly every post-psychotic tells me the same thing. They all say, or nearly all of them say, that prior to the psychosis there was a period of many months where they felt that the quality of their daydreams was different. I cannot make sweeping statements. The general pattern would seem to be that the daydreaming becomes stranger and even bizarre. This report is made stranger when they report a sparse occurrence of daydreaming in their previous healthy life. It is as if they daydream less, and then in the prodromal phase, they start to daydream, but have bizarre daydreams. The bizarrity worsens until the psychosis occurs. It would seem that there is some kind of internal upheaval or stress. I always imagine the psychosis as tectonic plates breaking apart and pressure like a tsunami, an earthquake or even a volcano occurring. The tsunami, earthquake and volcano are expressions of the tectonic movements. I shouldn't read too much into the changing daydream, other than to suggest that it is an indication and not a cause. I have never met a psychotic who had a rich fantasy life prior to his breakdown. This is absolutely amazing, if it is universal. The end result is the beauty of daydream, and the ability to use it as a tentative plan or as a safety valve is destroyed, if it ever was present. Does the child destined to be psychotic have a limited ability in that part of automatic thinking? Is that the reason when the need arises the safety valve is blocked? What is of no doubt is that this is the second phenomenon which they describe. But, this is all conjecture. Both you and I need far more proof. What is almost beyond dispute is that almost all of them tell me that they no longer daydream or fantasize after being psychotic. They are frightened to do so, and they say so quite openly when asked. In this respect, it reminds me very much of the way post-traumatic soldiers are treated. They don't want to return to the point of trauma where everything broke down. I have often noticed, as have many other Israeli psychiatrists, the similarity between the endpoint of severe PTSD and the chronic schizophrenic. The chronic schizophrenic, by definition, has many defects. By this, we mean his thought content, emotional response, reality testing and judgment are impoverished. The schizophrenic, as he becomes chronic, is similar to the ash remaining after a destructive blaze. I wonder how true this is? Are we merely seeing an adaptive avoidance of acts that are painful? With PTSD, it is blatantly obvious that the soldier does not want to go back. To avoid having flashbacks and unpleasant memories, he will avoid anything which involves imagination. Thus, we see in both processes the selection of the fittest thought, which involves imagination and fantasies, is severely curtailed. With PTSD, it may well be similar to that of avoiding using a limb because it is painful, and consequently, the patient suffers a frozen shoulder. Is it legitimate to say that the similar defects we see in PTSD and chronic schizophrenia, at least part of them, are simply that one is chosen, one is deliberately acquired, and one is indeliberately foisted upon the patient? If so, And again we need further proof. Can we teach our post-psychotics guided fantasies? I know that my mentioning of the ability to discern between good and bad is more than provocative. I know a lot of you will have difficulty with the problem. Nevertheless, this is my book, these are my experiences, and this is what I would have told David had he lived. I quite imagine David would have pulled a face at me, but all the same, I would have continued, and I'm going to do so now. It is my experience that few schizophrenic or psychotics are basically bad. The evil we see in psychopaths, sociopaths and some narcissists, we rarely see in the psychotics. Most of them are trying to do good things. They want the world to be a better place, they believe they are the very Messiah that can do good. They can see evil in others, and they may believe someone is the devil. But, I almost never had the experience of seeing a psychotic deluding that he is someone or something evil, other than a depressive who is explaining why he should be punished and explaining his feeling of depression. This is not evil. Another amazing thing about psychotics is, as much as everything around them is destroyed, they still retain the ability to believe. Sometimes, even quite often, the ability is distorted and becomes part of the delusions and hallucinations. Nevertheless, I cannot recall a religious person during a psychotic episode becoming non-religious. I have seen a lot of people who have exhibited their religiosity during a psychosis, again clothed in the delusions of the psychosis. Even when studying the psychotic, I am more than convinced that good and evil exists and feel that psychoses does not affect this. Even more surprisingly, I have rarely seen an evil psychotic. I have seen some very evil people, none of them with psychosis. You may well ask what happens to the psychotic's behavior. After all, we have discussed the psychotic in terms of the way he feels and the way he thinks. I cannot explain why, but the behavior of the psychotic also changes. It is more than the fact that he thinks differently and he feels differently. His ability to judge what is the meaning and impact of what he's doing also changes. It is as if he is no longer part of the herd. If you remember, we discussed this when we described behavior as being allowed dictation to the expectations of those around us. We live in ever-increasing circles of acquaintances, starting with mother and going up to the nation and more. Let me give you an example. Often I will ask a psychotic, if I were to tell you what you have told me and you are a psychiatrist, what would you say? I get differing kinds of answers. The first, and probably the best one you could ask for, is, I would consider you insane, but I am definitely not. At this point, there is no look of doubt on the patient's face. He is certain that what he is feeling is real and there is no significance that I would be insane yet. The psychotic is not. The second kind of answer I get is a simple denial that I cannot be thinking as I said, because the thought is unique to the psychotic. We can see and gain two insights. In the first instance, the psychotic is able to differentiate between himself and the rest of the world, but is not able to relate to himself in the same way as he relates to the rest of the world. We call this a lack of insight. In the second case, the psychotic is so far removed from reality that he cannot even conceptualize himself and me as being different. In fact, I don't exist. Now, to finalize this chapter by discussing, what for me, is the vexing question of paranoia. There are several forms of paranoia. The easiest to describe is paranoid schizophrenia. As in other cases of schizophrenia, there is an admixture of possible breakdowns between the conscious and subconscious and between the aware and unaware. As in all forms of paranoia, the selection of the appropriate thought is pathological. It is as if the thought mechanism is fixated on one possibility. That possibility is that the person is being persecuted. There is a condition called paranoid psychosis, where there is no doubt that the patient is psychotic, and the mechanism is very similar to that of paranoid schizophrenia. But, here something interesting happens. If you notice the destruction of the cognitive aspects of the affective psychoses, manic depression is less disturbed and disrupted than in schizophrenia. In schizophrenia, everything seems to be haywire, whereas in other psychoses, the processes are less disruptive. It is as if the connections are no longer leading to the right place. In schizophrenia, all the thoughts are bizarre, as if the brain is functioning in the sleep state. In the other psychoses, including paranoid psychoses, the connections and associations are more logical and are in the waking state. It is as if the paranoid psychotic, in this instance, is functioning in one sphere only. The ability to choose a bud is limited to one choice. That bud tells the paranoid psychotic he is persecuted. Because the explanations are not bizarre, the paranoid psychotic can be amazingly persuasive. In the army, one young soldier working in field security became paranoid and psychotic. He decided to investigate a top security base. In doing so, he took home all their highly classified files. On being hospitalized, he escaped. He went to the same base and did the same thing all over again. Another guy I was treating was the only Jew serving in the US forces in Sinai. For reasons known to himself and himself only, he decided that the US Army was taken over by Nazis and they were about to betray Israel. He threatened to go public, and he could not find a worse time, the beginnings of the First Gulf War. These guys were both very persuasive. I will mention him again in therapy. There is no equivalent to the paranoid neurosis. There are most certainly paranoid personalities. They make great detectives and counterintelligence officers. I will go into all this in a later chapter. Of course, there are paranoid personalities and there can be paranoid behavior. One thing I cannot explain, but is there nonetheless. The belief system changes. The psychotic believes something that you or I do not. I believe we should respect their beliefs. Live and let live, but it must be mutual. I will develop the implication in therapy and come back to it in treating ADHD. One last word, a psychosis is similar to an electric fire or a shifting tectonic plate. But, there is one difference. After 10 years, it seems to stop. By that I mean, when using the earthquake comparison, the land is stable. The scenery has changed drastically and all around the ruins of what was. If we use the electric storm comparison, the fires are over, the ashes and shells of what was remain. This has great consequence in therapy. In summary, we can gainfully say that psychoses is a breakdown of all our internal barriers and organization. It results in a complete chaos. I believe this gives us an insight into how important to evolution is the way we learn to react. There is no way a psychotic can exist without protection. Psychosis seems to be an evolutionary throwback. We may ask if we are beholden to the rule of survival of the fittest. How indeed do psychotics survive? More succinctly, why do they survive? The answer is they shouldn't, but they do. Maybe they are the first attempts to evolve beyond order as we know it. We tend to regard them as evolutionary throwbacks. They are not. Maybe, just maybe, this is mankind's first attempts to think as we feel in a non-binary fashion. Don't dismiss this thought as you turn the page.